I want to tell you about the wealthiest person I ever treated in 40 years of emergency medicine. I'm not going to use his name. I'm not going to tell you the name of his company or the exact figure attached to his net worth. He was a patient, and patients deserve a certain privacy, even after they're gone. What I will tell you is this. By every measure this country uses to decide whether a life has been successful, by every metric, every scoreboard, every system of recognition that we have built as a culture to signal that a person has made it, this man had won. He had built something from almost nothing. He had started with a small amount of inherited capital and a very large amount of will. And over 40 years he had made decisions. Hard decisions, costly decisions, sometimes ruthless decisions, that compounded into something that very few human beings in the history of this country ever accumulate. We are talking about a number that you and I struggle to hold in our minds because it is too large to feel real. His name was on buildings in 3 cities. His face had appeared on the cover of national business magazines. His phone calls, when he chose to make them, were returned within the hour by people who ran banks and governments. He arrived at my emergency department on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of what should have been an ordinary week. He was 67 years old. He was alone. I want you to hold that detail, not just the logistical aloneness of arriving by ambulance. That happens for all kinds of practical reasons that mean nothing. I mean the deeper kind of alone, the kind that doesn't announce itself in the first minutes, the kind that becomes visible slowly across the hours of a crisis, as the room fills with the wrong people and the phone rings without being answered, and a man with everything in the world spends the only window of clarity he has left trying to reach one person, and cannot. That is the story I want to tell you today, not as a cautionary tale with a tidy moral. As the most concentrated, most unambiguous version of a truth, I spent 40 years watching play out at every income level, in every kind of life. A truth so visible in this case that keeping it to myself would feel like a failure. So, let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon, and let me show you what $4 billion looks like when it runs out of things it can buy. The man who arrived, he came in by ambulance. His assistant, a young man of about 28, who had worked for him for 4 years, had been in the room when he collapsed during an afternoon meeting at his downtown office. The assistant called 911. He rode with him in the ambulance. He was the first person I spoke to when there was a moment to speak. The assistant was shaken in the specific way that people get shaken when they witness something that reorganizes their understanding of the world. Not just frightened, reorganized. He was standing in the hallway holding a phone in each hand. His own and his employer's, looking at both screens with the expression of someone who has been trained to solve every problem with one of those devices and has just encountered a problem that neither can solve. I asked him the standard question: who should we contact? Who needs to know he's here? The assistant looked at me. He said, "He has a son. I have a number for the son's office. I've never actually spoken to him directly." The son's office. I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count since that afternoon, because it contains, in 4 words, the entire architecture of a life. A man is in an emergency department, and the person closest to him professionally, the person who knows his coffee order, his preferred hotel in every city, his seat preference on every domestic airline, has a number for his son's office, has never been given anything more personal. In 4 years, the personal number was never offered, never came up, never felt like something that needed to exist. I didn't say anything. I took the number and went back to what needed to be done. But I noticed it. In 40 years of medicine, you develop a particular peripheral attention, the ability to register things happening around the medicine, while you are focused on the medicine itself. Details accumulate in the background without your choosing, and later, in the drive home, in the quiet of a house where someone used to be waiting, they come forward and ask to be considered. That detail came forward for years, what the money did and what it could not do. Within 40 minutes of his arrival, the hallway outside his treatment room had transformed into something I had not seen in my department before. His attorney arrived, not a paralegal, not an associate. The attorney himself, a man in his 60s, who had been interrupted mid-something significant and had come immediately, because that was the nature of what he owed this patient. Behind him, shortly after, his chief of staff and personal financial advisor, then a security consultant, then the woman who managed his communications. The hallway became, within 90 minutes, something resembling a small operations center. Laptops open, phones constant, quiet, controlled, professional conversations about matters I didn't understand and wasn't meant to. The full machinery of a significant life managing itself in real time around the fact of its owner's medical crisis. I want to say something clearly, because I think it matters for what I'm trying to tell you. Wealth does not change the medicine. The body does not respond differently to a physician's intervention because of the balance in the bank account. What wealth sometimes changes is the environment around the medicine, the speed of certain arrangements, the presence of specialized personnel, the particular controlled urgency of people accustomed to problems being solved by the application of resources. All of that was present in that hallway. What was also present, and what no amount of organizational efficiency or professional competence could address, was the complete absence of anyone in that room who loved him. Every person who walked through the door of his treatment room was there professionally. Every conversation happening near him, around him, sometimes across him, was a professional conversation. His world had responded with impressive speed. His people had not come. Because, as I understood across the hours of that afternoon, his people were not organized in a way that allowed them to come. They were not in the way that actually matters in a moment like this, his people at all. He had been married twice. The first marriage ended during the most demanding growth phase of his company, a period of 18-hour days and complete psychological immersion in the building of something he treated, without fully acknowledging it, as more urgent than everything else in his life, including the woman he had married and the young son they had together. The divorce was not traumatic. It was the quiet, formal acknowledgement of an absence that had already been in place for years. The second marriage lasted 11 years and ended more painfully, though by the end, the pain was almost beside the point. The pattern was established. The work was what the work was. The second woman he married had arrived eventually at the same conclusion as the first, that there was not, in practice, room in this man's life for a marriage that required his actual presence. She had not demanded something extraordinary. She had asked for the ordinary thing, to have a husband who was there when he was there. It was the one thing he could not consistently give. His son from the first marriage was now in his early 40s. Their relationship, as the assistant described it with careful language, was periodic. Occasional dinners when schedules aligned, a Christmas call. The maintained outline of a father-son relationship. The structure present, the substance thin, the thread of the real thing lost somewhere in the boy's childhood and never fully recovered. The son was reached that Tuesday afternoon by the office number at around 3 o'clock. He booked a flight. He did not arrive in time. The window and what he said in it. There is something I came to call, over the years, the window. A period of full, clear consciousness that arrives sometimes in the middle of a serious medical situation. Not predictably, not by design, but with a particular quality. The body, under significant threat, sometimes surfaces in this way. And when it does, the mind arrives at a clarity that ordinary days rarely produce. Freed for a brief period from the management of an ordinary life, and able to see things that the noise of that life typically conceals. That window opened for this man in the late afternoon, about 3 hours after he arrived. He had been sedated for a necessary procedure. When the sedation lifted, when he oriented himself to where he was and understood what was happening, there was a period of roughly 20 minutes in which he was entirely present, alert, himself, whatever version of himself 40 years of building had produced. I was in the room. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at me. And he said, in a voice quieter than I expected from a man whose voice I had read described in a profile from years ago as the kind that ended arguments, "Is my son here?" I told him his son was on his way, that a flight had been arranged. He nodded. Then, how long? I told him we weren't certain, that the flight was en route. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to talk to him." We brought him his phone, his own phone, the device that ran his world, that connected him in real time to the machinery of his empire that had been the most constant object in his hands for 40 years. The most powerful communication tool in the building, available to the most connected man in the room. He called his son. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He set the phone down on the sheet beside him. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. And the expression on his face was something I had not seen in quite that form in all my years. Not anger, not despair, not even grief in its recognizable form. Something more specific and more terrible than grief. Recognition. The look of a man who has spent 40 years not quite examining something, and who is now in a hospital bed on a Tuesday afternoon in Ohio, examining it with complete clarity for the first time. He said, not to me, just into the room. He doesn't know to pick up. A pause. He has no reason to pick up when I call. I never gave him a reason. I stayed very still. In emergency medicine, the most important skill is not the clinical knowledge. The clinical knowledge is essential. Without it, people die. But the skill that separates a good physician from a great one is something different. It is the ability to be present without filling the space. To hold a room for what a person needs to say in the moments when saying it is the only medicine that matters. You learn to recognize those moments. You learn not to walk out of them. I held the room, he said. I built something. 30,000 people work in something I built from nothing. Buildings with my name on them that will stand for 100 years. I made decisions that changed industries. I built something that cannot be ignored. He stopped, and my son doesn't pick up the phone when I call. A longer pause. Which of those things was a better use of my time? He was not asking me. He knew the answer. I suspect he had always known it the way people know things they have decided not to examine too closely, because the examination would require a change they were not ready to make, and a cost they were not ready to pay. He picked up the phone and tried a third time. This time, his son answered. I stepped out of the room. I don't know what was said. What passes between a father and a son in that kind of moment is theirs entirely. I would not have listened even if I had stayed. What I know is that the conversation happened. That when I returned, his face had changed. Not to peace, not quite, but to something in the direction of peace. The expression of a man who has said what needed to be said, however late, and who knows it was received. He looked at me, he said. He answered. I said, I wasn't sure he would. The young man in the hallway. Later that afternoon, when the immediate situation had reached a plateau, we knew what we were working with. We had done what could be done, and the outcome was in the hands of biology and time, the way outcomes always eventually are. I had a few minutes to check on the assistant. He was sitting alone in a corner of the hallway, both phones face down on his knees for the first time all day, looking at the middle distance. I sat down beside him. He was 28 years old. He had come to this man directly from business school, had built the early years of his professional identity around proximity to someone who was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of person young, ambitious men are told they should want to become. He had absorbed the ethos. He had worked the hours. He had taken pride in being indispensable. I asked how he was holding up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I keep coming back to the office number. That's what I had. 4 years I've worked for this man, and when it mattered, I had the office number for his son. I have his tailor's direct line, his barber in 3 different cities, the name of the maitre d' at his regular table in Washington. I know which hotel chain he'll accept and which he won't, what the ambient noise level has to be in a room before he can sleep, what he orders when he doesn't look at the menu. He stopped. I have never spoken to his son. In 4 years it never came up. The number was never offered. He said it without anger, without editorializing, with the quiet bewilderment of a person examining a fact that has just revealed its full meaning. That's not an accident, he said. That's not an oversight. That's a pattern. That's 40 years of small decisions, none of them dramatic, none of them made with any awareness of what they were building, but all of them in the same direction. And the direction produced a situation where the person who knows him best professionally has never spoken to the person who matters most personally. A pause. You can't build that by accident. You have to build it every day. One small choice at a time. He was 28 years old, and he had just understood something that takes most people a lifetime. I told him he was right, that it was not an accident. He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his personal phone, not the work one, and looked at it for a moment. And then he did something I found unexpectedly moving. He made a call, a personal one. I could tell from the immediate shift in his posture, the change in his voice. Softer, more present. The voice of a person calling, not because anything requires it, but because something in the last several hours has made a specific voice feel necessary in a way it hadn't felt necessary this morning. I got up and gave him his privacy, but I thought about him for a long time after, about the specific, graceful irony of what had just happened, that an afternoon spent watching a man with $4 billion fail to reach his son had produced, in the hallway, outside that room, a 28-year-old who stopped in the middle of everything and called someone he loved for no reason except that he had just understood the reason. 40 years to build the pattern. One afternoon to see it clearly enough to interrupt it. The information was always available. The choice was always available. Sometimes it takes a hospital hallway to make a person willing to use both. Gary, and what his waiting room looked like. I want to tell you about someone else. Not from the same day. I want to be accurate about that. But from the same period of my career. Close enough in time that the contrast was one I was actively sitting with. His name was Gary. He was a postal supervisor in a mid-sized Ohio city. He had worked the same route and risen in the same organization for 32 years. Not glamorous work, not the kind of life that gets profiled, but honest, consistent work done by a man who took his obligations seriously and met them every day without drama. Gary came in during his 63rd year with a serious cardiac situation. The kind we could work with. The kind where the outcome depended on what we did in the first hours and on the body's willingness to cooperate. His wife had died 2 years earlier. His 3 children, all in their 30s, all in different states, all living the full, scattered lives of people who had grown up and moved outward the way healthy children do, were notified when he arrived. All 3 of them came within 4 hours. When I walked out to the waiting area to speak with them, the first thing I saw was that they were already holding on to each other. Not because someone had told them to, not because the situation called for a display. The oldest daughter had her arm around her younger sister in the automatic, unconscious way of people for whom physical closeness in a moment of stress is simply what you do. The son was on his phone. Logistics, calls that needed to be made. But he was facing his sisters while he talked, staying in contact, not moving away from them even to have the conversation. They were a family in the full sense of the word. Not a perfect one. I'm certain they had their complications and their unresolved things, as every family does. But a unit, something you could feel in the room without being able to precisely name. The younger daughter kept saying quietly, almost to herself, "Dad's going to be fine. He's going to be fine." Not denial. Faith based on evidence. The accumulated evidence of a father who had been there, consistently, on the days when nothing required it. Who had made her feel, across her entire childhood and adult life, that she was the most important thing on his calendar. Gary recovered. 5 days, and he went home. I watched his children file past me on the way to his room once he was stable. 3 people in their 30s who had booked last-minute flights and driven through the night because it had not occurred to any of them to be anywhere else. Gary had not built an empire. Gary had not been on a magazine cover. Gary had not made decisions that moved markets. Gary had been home for dinner. Gary had coached the soccer team and made the Sunday calls and sat at the kitchen table on Tuesday evenings, being fully present in the room he was actually in. Gary had treated the daily, unremarkable, no occasion required investment in his children as the most important work of his life, because it was. On the day Gary needed people, the waiting room was full. On the day the man with $4 billion needed someone, his room held an attorney, a chief of staff, a financial advisor, and a young man who had never been given his son's cell phone number. I want to say this as plainly as I know how to say it. The difference between those 2 rooms is not about money. It has nothing to do with income or achievement, or the size of what a person builds. It is about where a person put their presence every ordinary day for the length of a life, and presence is a currency that is available to everyone. Equally, the postal supervisor and the billionaire had equal access to it. Gary used his, the other man did not. That is the only difference, what he said before he died. In the later hours of that Tuesday, when the situation had reached a kind of plateau, and I had a few minutes to be in that room without a clinical urgency driving me there, I sat with him. I want to be honest about why I stayed. There was nothing medical I needed to do in those particular minutes. I stayed because something in the room felt like it needed a witness. Because in 40 years, I had learned to trust that feeling. Because there are moments in this work that are not about the body at all. And the most useful thing you can do in them is be present for what a person needs to say before they no longer can. He was tired in a way that goes deeper than the physical. He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then, "You know what I never understood. Until today, I waited. I told myself the building was for them." That's what I said to my first wife, to my son, to myself, to anyone who asked why the hours were what they were. I said it was all in service of something. that the work was the vehicle, and the family was the destination, and eventually the vehicle would deliver us to the life I was building it for. He paused. My son didn't need the building. He needed me in the room. And I treated those two things as if they were the same side of the ledger, as if providing for him and being present for him were two versions of the same choice. They were never the same choice. He was quiet for a long time. Then he answered the phone. We talked. I said what I needed to say. Another pause. I don't know if it was enough. I suspect it wasn't enough to repair 40 years. But I said it. I told him that mattered. He looked at me with the direct, evaluating look of a man who has spent 4 decades distinguishing between things people say because they are true and things they say because they are kind. He said, "Does it?" At this point, I did not answer quickly. He deserved a real answer, not a comfortable one. I said, "Yes." Not because it repairs everything. You're right that it doesn't, and I think you already know what it does and doesn't repair. But yes, it matters. Because the alternative is nothing. Because your son is on an airplane right now because his father called him himself. Not through an assistant, not through an office, and wanted to hear his voice. That is not nothing. That is the most important thing you did today. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, just into the room. I should have called more. 7 words. Not the deals, not the marriages, not the strategic turns of a 40-year career, not the things that filled the magazines and moved the markets and put his name on buildings. I should have called more. The entire ledger, in 7 words. He died the following morning, before his son's flight landed. His son arrived 3 hours later. A colleague of mine was there when he arrived and was the one who had to tell him. She said he stood in the hallway very still and then asked just one question. Did he say anything? Was he able to say anything? She told him about the phone call, that his father had called himself, that no one had placed the call for him, that he had picked up the phone with his own hands and dialed the number and asked to hear his son's voice. The son closed his eyes. He said, "He called me himself," not a question. The specific tone of a person confirming something they need to hear confirmed before they can let themselves believe it. She said, "Yes, he called himself." The son stood there for another moment. Then he said very quietly, "Okay." Just that word. I have thought about that okay for a long time. The way my colleague described the sound of it, the specific weight of it, the grief in it and the relief in it and the complicated thing that exists between the two. It has stayed with me as clearly as anything from 40 years in that building. Something is not nothing. In the ledger of that relationship, the call mattered. It was not everything. It did not repair the years or restore what the deferral had cost. But it was real. It was his father's voice. His father had reached for the phone himself. That is what the son carried home. That okay. What money cannot buy, and what anyone can afford. I want to be careful here because I am aware this story can be heard as a simple lesson, and it is not a simple lesson. I want to honor its complexity. This man was not a villain. He was not a cold person who chose his career over his family in some deliberate calculation. He was a man who did what the culture around him rewarded, relentlessly, consistently, across 40 years, and who received so much validation for the building that he allowed the other things to move gradually to the edges of his life, without fully registering that they were moving. He did not intend to be a man whose son didn't pick up the phone. He simply never made the decision not to be. And that is the most important distinction I can draw from everything I saw in 40 years. Most people do not actively choose to neglect the things that matter most. They do not wake up one morning and decide to be half present in their marriage for 30 years, or to be the kind of father whose son needs a moment before answering the call. What they do instead is defer. They say yes to the urgent thing in front of them, the meeting, the deal, the window, the opportunity that has a cost if missed, and they say later to everything else. Not no, later, because later feels like a promise rather than a refusal. Later feels like there is still time. Later feels like the relationship is stable and patient and will be there on the other side of this particular demanding chapter. But the chapters do not end. I have never, in 40 years of medicine, met a patient who said, "The urgent things finally cleared. And then I had the time and space to be the person I wanted to be, with the people I most wanted to be present for." Not once. The urgent things do not clear, because the urgent things are not a temporary condition. They are the nature of a life lived in reactive mode. They replenish. They multiply. They are waiting every morning, and they will be waiting every morning until the morning you are in my emergency department. This man had $4 billion. He could not buy back the dinners, the ordinary evenings, the phone calls made for no reason, except that a father wanted his son to know that of all the calls he could be making, this one was the one he chose. The specific, unspectacular, irreplaceable accumulation of small moments that teach a child, then a teenager, then a man in his 40s, where he stands. That cannot be purchased retroactively. A large deposit in the final hour does not compensate for decades of small withdrawals. The account is either built or it isn't. And here is what I want you to understand about that account. The most important thing I have said today: it is funded in a currency that is available to everyone equally. Not money, not status, not the size of what you have built, or what you have accumulated, or how many people return your calls. Time, presence, the consistent daily choice to treat the people you love as if they are the most important thing on your calendar. Not because anything dramatic is happening, not because an occasion requires it, but because they are, and because they should know it from the evidence of ordinary days. Gary had the same access to that currency as the man with $4 billion. He just spent it differently. That is the only difference between those two waiting rooms. What 40 years taught me about the men who built and the men who stayed. I want to tell you about a pattern I observed across 40 years that I have never fully stated in these terms before, because stating it requires saying something about the generation I belong to and the culture I was trained in that is not entirely comfortable. The men who arrived at the final accounting most unprepared, whose windows of clarity were the most painful to witness, whose reaching was the most desperate, whose phones rang and went to voicemail, were almost never the men who had failed. They were almost never the men who had not provided, not worked, not taken their responsibilities seriously. They were, with striking consistency, the men who had succeeded, the men who had done exactly what the culture asked them to do, who had taken the implicit contract of American manhood in the second half of the 20th century seriously and honored its terms completely. Work hard, provide generously, build something that will protect and sustain the people who depend on you, who had understood their responsibility primarily as financial, logistical, structural, who had given their families the house and the education and the security and the material foundation, and who had believed in good faith that this was the central thing a man owed. They were not wrong that the provision mattered. They were wrong that it was sufficient, because the children growing up in those houses, the ones with the good schools and the reliable fathers and the materially stable childhoods, were not taking inventory of their financial security. They were taking inventory of presence, of attention, of the specific feeling of being the most important thing in a room to the person they most needed to feel that way about them. In house after house, generation after generation, the man was in the building while the children were taking that inventory. The man in the building believed he was doing it for them. The children taking the inventory registered that he was not there. Both things were simultaneously true. That is the complexity I am asking you to hold. He was providing. He was also absent. And the children, being people who needed what they needed regardless of what was being provided, registered the absence more than the provision. Not because they were ungrateful, because presence is not a substitute for provision, and provision is not a substitute for presence. They are different things. They go to different places in a person. And the place that presence goes to is the place that determines whether a son picks up the phone. The men who stayed, the ones who had decided somehow that their presence in the house was as important as their provision for it, those men died differently, not with more money, not with fewer difficult things to reconcile, but with a different quality of room around them. Full rooms. Rooms where people arrived without being asked. Rooms where the grief was real and present and not additionally complicated by all the things that were never said and all the time that was never given. And a father whose love was genuine but whose attention was chronically somewhere else. I am a man of that generation. I built the same incomplete understanding. I have told you what that cost Margaret and what those 8 months were when I finally understood it. I am not telling you this from superiority. I am telling you from the place of a man who learned the lesson with almost no ordinary time left to use it, and who would very much like you to learn it while your Tuesdays are still available. The call that has not yet been made. I want to be specific about what I am asking of you, because specificity is what separates a thing a person thinks about from a thing they actually do. I am not asking you to restructure your life, not asking you to quit building or stop providing or abandon the legitimate obligations of a responsible adult. The work has value. The provision is real. I would never tell you otherwise. What I am asking is much smaller and much more sustainable, and in its cumulative effect over time, much more significant. Tonight, after this, not next week, not when the project lands. Tonight, I am asking you to call one person. The person whose name came to mind somewhere in the last few minutes. You know who it is. There is always a name. The one you have been meaning to reach out to. The one you think about, but do not call, because nothing specific is happening and there is no occasion, and the call feels like something that should wait for a reason. There is no reason coming that is better than tonight. The absence of a reason is the point. The call made for no reason except that you wanted to hear their voice. That is the deposit. That is the thing the man with $4 billion could not make retroactively on a Tuesday afternoon in my emergency department. Not because he lacked the phone. He had the phone. He had the number. He had the will, finally, to dial. What he lacked was the years of calls made for no reason. The accumulated pattern of reach that teaches a person, over time, over hundreds of small, unremarkable moments, that they are on the short list, that their name appearing on the screen means he was thinking of me, not what does he need. Just he was thinking of me. You can start building that pattern tonight. One call, no agenda, 10 minutes if that is all you have. Just, I was thinking about you. How are you really doing? And then, listen. Actually listen. All the way to the end of the answer, without composing your response while they're still talking, without the half attention that has become so habitual that most of us no longer notice we are doing it. Because this is the most important call you will make today. More significant in its effect on the actual shape of your life than any meeting, any decision, any obligation currently on your calendar. I know how that sounds in the middle of a real week with real demands. I know the inbox does not empty. I know the urgency is always there, replenishing itself, making everything else feel like it can wait. But I have been in the room when this truth became fully visible to people who had spent decades managing it from a distance. And I am giving it to you now, while you still have ordinary time. Before any diagnosis, before any Tuesday afternoon that nobody saw coming, while the call can still become a pattern instead of a single late attempt. Make it tonight. The question you already know the answer to. I want to end with something honest, not comfortable, honest. When I tell this story, I do not tell it from the outside. I have told you about Margaret, about the 30 years I was in the same house and somewhere else, about the conversation she had with me in 2008 at the kitchen table. I need you to hear it, not process it, and about what I did with that conversation, which was not enough. About the 8 months at the end of her life that were the best months of our marriage for the worst reason imaginable. I am not the man with $4 billion. The scale is different. The external life looks different. But the operating assumption underneath it, the quiet conviction that the work was urgent and the relationship was stable and the relationship could absorb the weight of being secondary, because it always had, that was the same. I watched this pattern for 40 years in other people's lives. I believed it was one of the most important truths available to a human being. I understood it with the clarity of someone who had seen its endpoint hundreds of times. And I did it anyway. I tell you that not to punish myself with it. I have moved through that, and it is not productive. I tell you because I want you to understand. This is not a story about exceptional people making exceptional mistakes. It is a story about ordinary assumptions, running unexamined, doing their work quietly over decades. Those assumptions are in every house, including yours. The question I want you to sit with, not answer out loud, just sit with honestly in whatever private space you have, is this. If something happened today, nothing you are expecting, just a Tuesday afternoon that nobody saw coming, who would be in the room? And would they be there because of who you have been to them on the ordinary days? Or would they be there despite it? Both situations produce a room with people in it. The texture of what is in the room is not the same. Gary's children held onto each other before I had finished speaking. They were not there performing. There was nowhere else in the world they would be. You are building toward one room or the other right now, today. Whether you are thinking about it or not, every Tuesday evening is a deposit or a withdrawal. Every phone call made for no reason is a deposit. Every time you set down what you are carrying and give the real thing, not the performance of presence, the actual thing, to the person in the room with you. That is a deposit. And the compound interest on those deposits is the room that fills without hesitation when the day comes. Start tonight, not with a grand gesture, not with a declaration. Put the phone down. Sit at the table. Ask how someone's day was, and listen to the whole answer. Call the person whose name came to mind while you were listening to this. Not because anything has happened, because they are the reason. That call, made tonight for no occasion except that you wanted to hear their voice, that call is worth more than anything you will accomplish in the next hour. I know this because I was in the room when a man with $4 billion understood it too late. I know it because I watched Gary's 3 children hold on to each other in my waiting room. And I know it because I spent 30 years in a house where someone waited for me to understand it. And I am living in that house alone now, and I understand it completely, and I would give almost anything to have understood it sooner. You still have sooner. The account is not empty. The door is not closed. The person whose name just came to mind is still there, still carrying a version of you in their heart that hopes you will reach out. That would receive a call from you tonight, not as an obligation or a surprise, but as exactly what they have been quietly hoping for. People do not stop hoping for the people they love to show up. They just learn, after a while, not to mention it. In the comments, just leave me a name. The name of the person you're going to call tonight. You don't have to explain anything, just the name. I'll read every one. My name is Dr. Edward Carver. I'll see you in the next one.